is there a truly reality out there that humans can really know? It's an age-old battle between realists and absolutists. God is not great, how religion ruins everything. And yet it's utterly and totally ridiculous. We need to live for something beyond ourselves. You know, many of you might be too young to remember the Ford Pinto. It was a horrible little contraption created by Detroit in the 1970s. It soon became apparent that the car was very dangerous. In a rear-end collision, the gas tank would explode, killing and seriously burning the passengers. Well, the bigwigs at Ford did a little math, and they estimated the number of people each year who would be killed or maimed by those gas tank explosions. Then they computed how much each lawsuit would cost them for these deaths and injuries in contrast to what it would cost them to fix the car. In the end, guess what? Because it was cheaper to pay the lawsuits, Ford decided to leave the car as it was. In other words, let people get burned, let people get maimed, let people get killed. That's okay because it's cheaper. It was cheaper than fixing. Talk about injustice. You know, the world we know is filled with injustice. I mean, all the time we see it all around. And of course, we don't have to look at others. How many of ourselves have faced injustice? Been betrayed by a friend, by a lover, by a spouse. You know, we've all seen the injustice that just reeks in the world. You know, years ago, a German philosopher named Immanuel Kant made a very simple point. He said, if you could accept one premise, just one premise, that premise that God is just, then he argued for an afterlife. And his point was very simple. There has to be some kind of afterlife because there's no justice in this life. And if God is a just God, then there's going to have to be some kind of ultimate afterlife, some kind of ultimate final reckoning, because we're not getting that justice in this life, that's for sure. There certainly is no justice now, and it's true. The Bible does talk time and time again about God's justice and about the justice of God, and that there will be retribution made once and for all the injustice in the world. And I'm very glad for that. But you know, there's another side to this. There's another side to this whole idea of judgment. And it's so often missed by people, particularly Christians, when they talk about God's judgments and all the statements about judgment. I'm going to read you one text from the Bible. It's from the book of John. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. To save the world. That's why he sent him. Yes, God is a God of justice. He's got to be. There has to be justice. We all cry out for justice. And yes, God is a God of judgment. There needs to be judgment. There needs to be justice. But God is also a God of mercy and grace and forgiveness. And God's great desire for our world, and even for each of us, it's not to condemn us. It's his great desire to save us. God does not want to punish us for what we deserve. Think about it for a moment. I want you to think about something for a moment. Think about, suppose there really is a God. Okay? It's not an unreasonable proposition, despite what people say. And suppose this God is a moral God. He's got a sense of morality, not an irrational thought either. And suppose, as the Bible says it's true, that God is going to bring every judgment and every work and every action and every wrong deed and every evil thing into judgment. There's a promise in the Bible that God is going to do that. Everything, good and evil. Now let me ask you a question. Just something to think about. If you were to believe that, and assume for a moment you believe that, how do you think you would fare? How do you think you would fare standing before a God who knows every dirty little secret, every dark and hidden thing you've ever done in your life? How do you think you would fare? And, oh, don't give me this thing, you're better than others. You know, I mean, Al Capone, Al Capone was no Joseph Goebbels. Al Capone was a lot more moral, a lot better guy than Joseph Goebbels. But nobody's going to call Al Capone a moral person. So I guess the question is, forget about everybody else. Forget about comparing yourself to Joe Blow here or there. It's easy. You're always going to find somebody who's, quote, worse than you. Put aside all that. But if there is a God, and God is a God of judgment, and if Jesus even once said, lusting in your heart is the same as committing adultery, let me ask you a question. How well do you think you would stand before this God? Suppose, there's these very precise scientists have come across and they've shown these anthropic coincidences and how everything in nature is so finely tuned, and you get off the slightest, the force of the atoms, if they're off by some of the tiniest amount, life we know couldn't exist. But suppose there is a God, and suppose he's got a moral code that's just as precise, that's just as exacting, that's just as demanding. How well do you think you would fare before that God? And again, I'm not saying you're better than Joe, you're better than Sue, you're better than Sally, you're better than Mike. Okay, that's fine. I'm asking about how would you alone stand before God? That's a pretty scary thought, don't you think? Having an answer for everything you did. And yet the point is, here's the bottom line of Christianity. Here's the bottom line, is that the Bible offers you a way out. It's called the gospel. It's taught all through the Bible. And it's the idea that in the end, God's grace can cover you, that you do not have to answer for all these things, that you could stand before God under the righteousness of Jesus, and all the bad things you've ever done could be forgiven, that you won't have to answer for that. You won't have to face it. You won't have to stand before God for all these things you have done. I mean, think about it. Look up at the sky. There really, really might be a God out there who created everything here. And with apologies to Richard Dawkins and so forth, it's not that crazy of an idea. It's not that far-fetched of a notion. I would argue and argue vehemently that logic and reason is much more on the side of those who do believe in God, than those who don't believe in God. And if there is a God, and he happens to be a just God, and he happens to be a God of judgment, then one day we know justice will be done. But he's not just a God of justice. Scripture said he's also a God of mercy and grace. Because if he wasn't a God of mercy and grace, I don't think any of us would stand a chance. Again, don't compare yourself to someone else. Think about how you yourself would fare standing before a God who knows every thought, every evil thing, every deed, maybe even things you forgot about. But the good news on all this is that the Bible offers, according to the Bible, God offers all of us a way out. None of us have to stand condemned. None of us have to stand, damned by the things we have done. And the Bible calls it grace. It's the promise of grace. Again, think about it. How would you stand in judgment? What hope would you have if you had to answer for all the things you ever done? The Bible says, basically, we're all condemned. But through Jesus, there is an offer of grace, of forgiveness. And all things considered, considering what the options are, I think it would be a very wise, logical thing to at least check it out and find out for yourself what that offer of grace is and what it can mean to you as an individual person.